Hello everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment below if you enjoy stories like this before going to sleep. Your support keeps the channel alive, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about tonight's journey. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's step into the snow-covered streets of Chicago. It was December 18th, 2019, a Wednesday evening that had already turned bitterly cold by the time the clock struck 10 p.m. The platforms of Union Station in Chicago were unusually quiet, the kind of silence that only comes when snow is falling thick and steady, muffling the usual rush of voices and the echo of hurried footsteps. Among the few travelers waiting for the late departure was Michael Turner, a 35-year-old architect from Evanston. He had just finished a draining week working on a project downtown, and all he wanted was to catch the last train out to Milwaukee, where his parents were expecting him for the holidays. Wrapped in his dark overcoat, Michael checked his watch nervously. The announcement board above flickered, displaying delays across nearly every line. The snowstorm had already grounded flights at O'Hare, and the highways were reported treacherous with black ice. The train was his only chance of getting out of the city that night. A few seats away sat Anna Mitchell, a graduate student at Northwestern, with a red scarf loosely draped around her neck. She was scribbling in a leather-bound notebook, pausing every so often to glance at the tracks outside, where snow piled higher by the minute. The dim yellow lights above cast soft shadows across her face, giving her a look of tired determination. The loudspeaker crackled, startling everyone in the waiting hall. Attention passengers. The 10:30 p.m. Hiawatha service to Milwaukee is delayed due to severe weather conditions. Please remain in the station until further notice. A collective sigh rose from the small crowd. Some cursed under their breath, while others pulled out their phones, scrolling through weather updates. Michael rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of disappointment pressing down on him. He couldn't help but think of his mother's voice over the phone earlier that day. Warm, insistent, and hopeful. "Don't be late, Michael. Your father has been looking forward to this all week." The station's massive glass ceiling revealed the storm in all its fury. Snowflakes danced wildly in the air, driven by the sharp winds off Lake Michigan. Inside, though, there was a fragile cocoon of warmth. Coffee machines humming in the corner, the faint rustle of newspapers, and the low murmur of conversations between strangers bound together by circumstance. Michael's gaze drifted back to Anna, noticing her shiver slightly despite her scarf. For a moment, he hesitated, then finally spoke. "Cold night to be traveling, isn't it?" Anna looked up, startled, then gave a faint smile. "Colder than I expected. I'm starting to think we won't even make it out tonight." Her voice carried a mix of resignation and quiet hope. Michael nodded, settling into the chair beside her. The two began to talk, first about the weather, then about where they were headed, and eventually about everything else. Work, studies, family traditions. The hours seemed to bend around them, time stretching thin as the storm raged on outside. It was just after midnight when the station doors suddenly slammed open with a violent gust of wind. A man in a heavy brown coat stumbled inside, shaking the snow from his shoulders. He looked disoriented, his eyes darting across the room as if searching for someone. The quiet of the hall shifted, a ripple of unease moving through the small group of passengers. Michael exchanged a glance with Anna, sensing that something about the man's presence didn't fit with the ordinary frustrations of a delayed journey. And that was when the loudspeaker came alive again. The announcer's voice strained and urgent this time. The loudspeaker's static buzzed for a second before the voice returned, slightly shaky, as if the announcer himself was nervous. Attention passengers, the last train to Milwaukee will now depart at 12:45 a.m. from Platform 7. Please make your way to the boarding area. A collective relief washed over the passengers scattered in the waiting hall. Some immediately stood up, clutching their bags tightly, eager to leave the echoing silence of Union Station. Others moved more slowly, still wary of the storm outside, unsure if the train would even make it beyond the city limits. Michael rose from his seat, adjusting the strap of his leather bag across his shoulder. He glanced at Anna, who was still scribbling something hastily into her notebook. She looked up at him with a tired smile. "Well, I guess this is it. Maybe we'll make it after all." "Let's hope so," Michael replied, offering a hand to help her up. She hesitated only a second before taking it, her palm cold but firm. They joined the small line of travelers making their way toward Platform 7, boots crunching on the gritty floor that had been dusted with snow carried in from outside. The man in the brown coat was ahead of them, his steps quick and unsteady. He kept looking over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to follow him. His eyes met Michael's for a fleeting second, and in that brief exchange, Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. There was something haunted in the man's expression, something desperate. Platform 7 was dimly lit, the overhead lamps flickering under the weight of frozen snow that clung to the metal frames. The train waited, its windows glowing faintly against the darkness. Steam hissed from beneath it, clouding the air with a ghostly mist. Conductors in thick coats moved briskly along the cars, checking tickets and ushering people aboard. Michael and Anna found their seats near the middle of the train. The carriage was nearly empty, perhaps only a dozen passengers scattered across the rows. The seats were upholstered in dark blue fabric, faintly worn from years of travel. The rhythmic hum of the heating system filled the space, bringing a welcome comfort against the bitter cold outside. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Passengers settled in, bags stowed above, coats shrugged off, the atmosphere heavy but calm. Then the whistle blew, sharp and piercing, and slowly, with a groan of metal on metal, the last train out of Chicago began to move. Snowflakes smeared across the windows as the train crawled forward, leaving behind the glowing platforms of Union Station. The city lights blurred in the distance, then faded entirely as they rolled into the storm. Inside, the carriage swayed gently, the rhythm of the tracks steadying the nerves of those on board. Anna leaned her head against the window, watching the endless white outside. "It feels strange," she murmured, "like we're the only ones moving through the world right now." Michael nodded, though his thoughts lingered on the man in the brown coat. He had chosen a seat several rows behind them, and though he sat alone, he never seemed to rest. He shifted constantly, glancing around the carriage, gripping something tightly beneath his coat. Michael tried to look away, but unease settled in the pit of his stomach. At 1:30 a.m., somewhere past Glenview, the train jerked slightly, slowing as it fought against the thick snow on the tracks. A few passengers stirred, pulling their coats tighter. The conductor's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather, we may experience some delays. Please remain in your seats, and we thank you for your patience." Michael turned to Anna, who had closed her notebook and was now watching him with curious eyes. "You keep looking at that man," she said softly. "Do you know him?" Michael shook his head. "No, but There's something about him, like he doesn't want to be here, but he has no choice. Anna followed his gaze discreetly. The man in the brown coat had pulled out an old envelope, yellowed with age, and was staring at it as though it held the answers to something he had long forgotten. His lips moved slightly, whispering words no one else could hear. The storm outside grew heavier, snow hammering against the train with relentless force. The carriage lights flickered once, then steadied, but the sudden darkness that had swallowed them for a moment drew a nervous murmur from the passengers. Michael felt his pulse quicken. He glanced at Anna, who looked equally unsettled. At 2 a.m., the train made an unscheduled stop in a small, nameless town. Through the foggy window, Michael could make out the faint outline of a platform buried in snow. No station lights glowed. No one was waiting. The only sound was the howl of the wind, rattling against the sides of the train. The doors opened briefly, letting in a blast of cold air. No one boarded, and no one left. When the doors closed again, the train remained still, as if hesitating. Then slowly, it pushed forward once more into the storm. Michael leaned closer to Anna. Something doesn't feel right about this trip. She gave a faint laugh, though her eyes betrayed the same unease he felt. It's just the weather. We'll be fine once we're closer to Milwaukee. But as the minutes stretched on, the tension in the carriage grew thicker. The man in the brown coat finally stood, moving unsteadily down the aisle. Every eye seemed to follow him. He paused near the center, gripping the seat back for support, his breath heavy and uneven. Then, in a hoarse voice, barely above a whisper, he said, "Someone is following me. I thought I could get away on this train, but he's still here." A stunned silence fell over the carriage. Michael's heart pounded in his chest. He exchanged a quick look with Anna, who looked pale. The other passengers shifted uneasily, whispering among themselves. The man's eyes darted from face to face, wild with fear. He clutched the envelope tighter, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice trembling. "He's been after me for years, and tonight, he's closer than ever." Before anyone could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the carriage into near darkness. The train screeched against the rails as if fighting to stay on course. For a split second, Michael thought he saw a shadow move past the window outside, a figure outlined against the storm. But when the lights steadied once more, there was nothing, only snow and night. Anna reached for Michael's arm, her grip tight. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Michael swallowed hard. "I don't know what I saw." The man in the brown coat stumbled back toward his seat, muttering under his breath. The envelope slipped slightly from his grasp, revealing the corner of a photograph inside. Michael caught a glimpse, an old black and white picture of two men in military uniforms, one of them unmistakably the man on the train, years younger, the other obscured by time and damage. Questions swirled in Michael's mind, but before he could ask, the train lurched violently, sending passengers sprawling in their seats. The screech of metal filled the carriage, and outside, a blinding light cut through the storm. The train ground to a halt in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but endless snow. The conductor's voice came over the intercom again, this time strained, almost panicked. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are dealing with an unexpected situation." Michael's chest tightened. Anna leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Something's out there." And in the silence that followed, they all heard it. the crunch of footsteps on snow slowly approaching the train. The footsteps outside were steady, crunching against the thick blanket of snow. Every few seconds, they would pause, then continue again, drawing closer to the halted train. Inside the carriage, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the heating system and the restless rattle of the storm against the windows. Michael's hand instinctively tightened around the armrest. He felt Anna's grip still firm on his sleeve. Their eyes met, and though neither said a word, both understood the unease that was quickly turning into fear. The conductor appeared at the front of the carriage, his cap dusted with frost, his face pale. "Everything is fine," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've stopped for safety reasons. Just please remain seated until we have clearance to move again." A murmur rose among the passengers, skeptical and anxious. Michael turned his head slightly, glancing at the man in the brown coat. He was staring intently out the window, lips moving as if reciting a prayer. The envelope clutched so tightly his knuckles were white. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the world was utterly still, as though the storm itself had hushed to listen. Then, a faint thud echoed against the side of the carriage, followed by another and another. Something, or someone, was walking alongside the train, brushing against the metal as it moved. Anna whispered, barely audible, "Tell me you hear that too." "I hear it," Michael replied, his chest tight. A passenger across the aisle, a man in his 50s with a gray scarf, stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "It's just the wind, nothing more." He moved toward the window, wiping away the condensation with his sleeve to get a better view. The moment his hand cleared the glass, he froze. His face drained of color, and he stumbled backward. "What is it?" someone asked sharply. The man shook his head, his voice trembling. "There's someone out there, just standing, watching us." The carriage erupted in whispers and nervous exclamations. People craned their necks to see, but the storm outside was too thick, the snow swirling furiously. Only Michael caught a glimpse, just a silhouette, faint against the white, tall and motionless. The lights flickered again, dimming lower this time. The hum of the heating faltered, then groaned back to life. The conductor hurried toward the rear, speaking into his radio in clipped, anxious tones. Michael leaned closer to Anna. "We shouldn't just sit here. Something's wrong." Anna nodded, but her voice shook. "Where would we even go? We're in the middle of nowhere." The man in the brown coat suddenly stood, his movements sharp, almost frantic. "It's him," he said hoarsely. "He found me. I told you he would." His eyes darted to Michael, then to Anna, then around the carriage as if pleading for someone to believe him. "We have to get off this train. If we stay here, he'll come inside." The gray scarf passenger snapped at him. "Sit down, you're scaring people." But Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't entirely wrong. He remembered the photograph tucked inside the envelope. The younger version of the man in uniform, standing beside someone whose face had been blurred by damage. He wanted to ask about it, but now was not the moment. The footsteps returned, circling the train this time, slow and deliberate. A woman in the back began to sob quietly, muffling her face against her coat. The conductor reappeared, his expression strained, as though he had seen something he could not explain. "Ladies and gentlemen, please stay calm. We are handling the situation. The authorities have been contacted." Michael rose halfway from his seat. "What situation? Who's out there?" The conductor hesitated. His eyes flicked toward the window, then back to Michael. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "But don't draw attention. Just stay still." The train shuddered suddenly, as if struck. The lights dimmed to near darkness, leaving only the faint emergency glow strips along the floor. The passengers gasped. Anna clutched Michael's arm tightly, her breath quick and shallow. And then came the knock. A slow, deliberate knock against the carriage door. 3 raps, evenly spaced. Silence followed, heavier than before. The man in the brown coat let out a strangled cry. "It's him! Don't open it!" He pressed himself against the seat, shielding the envelope against his chest. His fear was raw, almost contagious. The conductor moved toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. A few passengers shouted in protest, telling him not to. Michael stood abruptly, his heart pounding, his voice stronger than he expected. "Don't open it." The conductor froze, his eyes wide. For a moment, indecision paralyzed him. The knock came again, louder this time. Michael glanced at Anna. She shook her head, silently begging him not to go closer. But curiosity burned inside him, mixed with dread. Whoever, or whatever, was outside knew exactly where they were, and pretending otherwise would not keep them safe. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the night, like a gunshot carried on the wind. The silhouette outside vanished into the storm. The knocking stopped. The only sound left was the howl of the blizzard against the train. The passengers sat in stunned silence. The conductor lowered his hand from the door, his chest heaving. Slowly, the lights flickered back to life, though weaker than before. The man in the brown coat sagged into his seat, whispering frantically. Michael caught fragments, names, places, dates, but nothing clear. The photograph slipped halfway from the envelope again, and this time Michael saw more of it. 2 young soldiers in World War II uniforms, standing shoulder to shoulder. One of them unmistakably the man before him, the other bearing a resemblance so strong it sent a chill down Michael's spine. The second man could almost have been a ghost of him. Michael's thoughts swirled. Was the figure outside real? A person? Or something else entirely? Tied to the man's past? The train lurched forward again slowly, as if reluctant to continue. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but said little. The storm outside raged on, relentless. Anna leaned close to Michael, her voice shaking but steady. "We need to know who he is. Why he's so afraid." Michael nodded, his eyes fixed on the man in the brown coat. There was no denying it anymore. Whatever haunted him was now haunting everyone on that train. The night was far from over, and the storm outside was only the beginning. The train pressed forward through the blizzard, its wheels grinding against icy tracks. The rhythm of the engine usually gave comfort, but tonight it felt uneasy, hesitant, as though the machine itself understood the danger outside. Michael could not take his eyes off the man in the brown coat. His hands trembled violently, clutching the old envelope to his chest like a shield. His lips moved, whispering words that Michael tried to catch but could not. They sounded like names, fragments of places long gone, and half-remembered prayers. Anna sat close beside him, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. She leaned forward slightly, her voice low. "We need to talk to him. Whatever's happening, he knows more than anyone else on this train." Michael nodded slowly, his heart still beating fast from the knocking at the carriage door. He rose from his seat and approached the man cautiously, not wanting to startle him further. "Sir," Michael said gently, crouching slightly so their eyes met. "What's happening? Who do you think is out there?" The man's bloodshot eyes flickered with fear. For a long moment, he said nothing, then finally whispered, "I thought I left it all behind, but it's followed me. Decades, and still he finds me." Michael pressed. The man clutched the envelope tighter. He hesitated, then pulled it open just enough to reveal the faded photograph inside. Two young soldiers in uniform, snow on their boots, rifles slung over their shoulders. One was clearly him, younger and stronger, a proud smile on his face. The other man's face was sharp, angular, with eyes that burned even through the grain of old film. "That's him," the man said, his voice breaking. "We served together in Europe. 1944. We swore an oath, but he betrayed us. He betrayed me." Michael's breath caught. That was more than 70 years ago. The man nodded, his hands trembling. "He should be dead, but he's not. He never died, and he wants me to remember." Anna leaned in, her brow furrowed. "Remember what?" The man's eyes darted toward the window, where snow smeared the glass in thick white streaks. "The night in the forest, the blood on the snow. I buried it. Thought time would erase it. But you can't bury something like that. It comes back." Before Michael could ask more, the train gave a violent jolt. Passengers cried out as bags tumbled from overhead racks. The lights flickered, dimming to a dull glow. Then came the sound again. Footsteps on snow, deliberate and slow, pacing along the outside of the train. A woman 2 rows back began to sob openly, clutching her child against her chest. The conductor rushed down the aisle, his face pale, radio in hand. "We need everyone to remain calm," he said, though his own voice was shaking. There's no danger to you. We're in contact with the dispatch." But his words rang hollow. Every passenger could hear it. The footsteps circling, the scrape of something against the metal hull of the carriage. Michael stood, his jaw set. He could no longer sit idle. "We can't just ignore it," he said to the conductor. "Something's out there. You know it as well as we do." The conductor hesitated, then glanced nervously toward the front of the train. "We've stopped in Glenview soon. Police will meet us there." But Michael knew, from the look in the man's eyes, that he did not believe his own words. The footsteps stopped suddenly. Silence fell, deep and suffocating. Then, without warning, every light in the carriage went out. The world plunged into darkness, broken only by the faint glow of snow outside. Passengers screamed, some fumbling for their phones, others clutching one another. Michael felt Anna's hand grip his arm, trembling. He turned toward her, though he could barely see her outline in the dim glow. "Stay close to me," he whispered. From the back of the carriage came a sound that chilled everyone to the bone. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, not on the door this time, but against the window. Michael turned sharply, staring into the darkness. Through the fogged glass, a shadow stood, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. Taller than most, motionless, waiting. The man in the brown coat let out a hoarse cry. "It's him! It's him! Don't let him in!" He collapsed into his seat, clutching the envelope like a lifeline. The shadow remained at the window for several long seconds, then slowly drifted out of sight. The footsteps resumed, circling again, closer this time, until they stopped directly outside the carriage door. The conductor moved to block the entrance, his body rigid, his face set with grim determination. "No one is opening that door," he said, more to himself than anyone else. Then, as suddenly as it had gone dark, the lights returned, buzzing weakly overhead. The passengers sat frozen, their breaths heavy in the silence. Anna leaned close to Michael, whispering quickly, "We need to know what happened in that forest. Whatever this thing is, it's tied to him. If we don't understand it, we'll never get out of here." Michael nodded, turning back to the man in the brown coat. His face was pale, sweat glistening on his forehead despite the cold. His hands shook violently, but when Michael placed a steady hand on his shoulder, he finally met his eyes. "Tell us," Michael said firmly. "If you want to survive this, you have to tell us the truth." The man closed his eyes, his breath shallow. For a long time, he was silent, and the only sound was the creak of the train as it pushed slowly through the storm. Then, in a voice raw with guilt, he began. "We were ordered into the Ardennes, December 44. The snow was deep, the nights long. Supplies were scarce, nerves even scarcer. We were boys pretending to be men. He was my brother in arms, until that night." His voice cracked, but he forced himself onward. "We found a cabin abandoned, or so we thought. There were villagers hiding there. He wanted to silence them, said they would betray our position to the enemy. I said no. We argued, shouted, nearly came to blows. But in the end," his hands clenched the envelope tighter. "In the end, I turned my back. I let him do it." And the snow ran red. Anna's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh God!" Michael's stomach turned, the horror settling in. "And after?" The man shook his head. "He vanished that night. Some said the enemy took him. Some said he deserted. But I knew he'd come for me one day. Because I watched and did nothing. I let him carry that sin while I pretended to be innocent. And he never forgave me." The footsteps outside returned, louder now, pounding against the snow, pacing back and forth. A low, guttural sound carried through the storm, not quite human, not quite animal. The man in the brown coat gripped Michael's sleeve desperately. "He's here because I never confessed, because I let the dead rest in silence. And now he wants me to pay." The train lurched suddenly, brakes screeching, throwing passengers against their seats. Outside the windows, a faint glow appeared, lamps of a small station platform barely visible through the storm. The conductor shouted over the chaos. "Glenview, everyone stay seated until police arrive." But Michael knew in his gut this was not something the police could fix. He turned to Anna, then to the trembling man beside him. The storm might have brought them together, but the night was far from over. The shadow still waited outside, and sooner or later, it would find a way in. The desert air outside was growing colder as the night thickened. A thin wind swept across the highway, lifting grains of dust that shimmered briefly in the yellow glow of the old neon sign. The silence around the motel was unnatural, as if the place existed in a pocket outside of time. Inside, John sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the faded curtains. His phone showed no signal, and when he checked again, the battery had dropped another few percent. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to grow louder in the absence of any other noise. Then, faintly, he thought he heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, dragging, as though someone was carrying a burden. John froze, holding his breath. The sound stopped just outside his door, followed by a pause that lasted far too long. He leaned forward, staring at the shadow at the bottom gap of the door. It didn't move, and then, as suddenly as it came, it was gone. John exhaled sharply, trying to shake off the unease. He opened the small nightstand drawer, hoping for some kind of motel Bible or note that could distract him. Instead, he found a folded piece of paper. The edges were yellowed, and the handwriting on it was shaky, as though written in haste. It simply read, "Do not stay past 3 a.m. checkout, no matter what." John's throat tightened. He checked the clock again. It was 1:47 a.m. He wanted to laugh it off as some kind of prank left behind by another guest, but his gut told him otherwise. The strange way the clerk had looked at him when handing over the key replayed in his mind. The quick, darting eyes, the unspoken warning. Deciding he couldn't sit still, John grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The hallway smelled faintly of mold and cigarette smoke. The carpet under his shoes was threadbare, and the wallpaper peeled in long strips. The silence returned, heavier now, as if the motel itself were listening. At the far end of the corridor, a single bulb flickered, then buzzed out completely, leaving the corner in darkness. John hesitated, then walked slowly toward the front lobby. The reception desk was empty. The logbook lay open on the counter, filled with neat entries of names and dates. But as John leaned closer, he realized the dates were all from decades ago. The last entry was from 1979, written in careful cursive. Guest checked in. Room 6. Room 6. The very room he was staying in. He stepped back, heart pounding, when he caught something in the glass reflection of the lobby door. A shape, tall and unmoving, standing just behind him. He spun around. Nothing was there. Only the desk and the silent hallway. Trying to steady himself, John pushed through the lobby doors and out into the desert night. The chill cut through his jacket as he crossed the gravel lot, staring at the cars parked there. But as he passed the first row, his breath caught. The vehicles weren't modern. They looked abandoned, coated in dust, their license plates from the 70s. A red Chevrolet Impala, a blue Ford pickup, and a white station wagon sat in silence, like relics left to rot. He hurried back toward his room, but when he reached for the door handle, it wouldn't turn. The lock clicked from the inside. John knocked, then slammed his fist against the wood. No answer. And then a voice drifted from within. A low, whispering drawl that sent a shiver through his bones. "You checked in. You don't check out." The air seemed to thicken around him, the neon glow outside flickering violently. John staggered back, unsure if he should run to the highway or stay. He turned his head, searching for the clerk, but the lobby windows were now dark. From somewhere deep inside the motel, a woman screamed. It was sharp, desperate, and cut off suddenly as though smothered. John's instincts screamed at him to flee, yet his feet felt rooted to the ground. The clock inside the room ticked on. 2:18 a.m. The warning note replayed in his mind. Do not stay past 3 a.m. John realized he had less than an hour to figure out how to escape. He took a shaky breath and forced himself back toward the lobby, this time determined to look for the clerk. The door creaked as he pushed it open again, the smell of stale dust hitting him harder now. Behind the counter, he noticed a door half open, leading to what looked like a small office. Inside, the walls were lined with old photographs, black and white portraits of men, women, and children, all staring blankly at the camera. But the strangest part was that each photo had the same background. The front of the motel, with the glowing Route 66 sign. Some of the faces looked familiar. John's stomach dropped when he spotted the last photo on the wall. It was him. The picture showed him standing outside the very room he had checked into, looking directly at the camera with a hollow expression. He had no memory of ever posing for it. His hands shook as he stepped back, nearly tripping over a box on the floor. Inside were dozens of room keys, each labeled with numbers, each tag rusted and worn. Suddenly, a sound came from the hallway outside the office. Not footsteps this time, but something dragging along the wall, like nails scraping the plaster. John backed into the office corner, heart pounding, the warning note burning in his pocket. The scraping sound drew closer, slow and deliberate, heading toward the lobby. He knew he couldn't just wait. He had 40 minutes left until 3 a.m. And if the note was true, staying meant something worse than death. But where could he go? The night had not yet reached its deepest silence when the old townhouse on Marlborough Street seemed to come alive with a peculiar rhythm. The unexpected gathering that had started with no invitation kept drawing in more faces, each carrying their own stories, voices, and laughter. By 11:30, the hallway had grown warm from the constant exchange of bodies, jackets draped over the banister, and half-empty glasses perched on window ledges. Emily found herself pressed against the living room wall, her eyes following the movement of strangers whose name she might never know. Her phone buzzed occasionally, but she ignored it. There was something magnetic about the evening, a sense that if she looked away for too long, she would miss a moment worth remembering. Across the room, James adjusted his shirt collar, leaning into a conversation with a tall student from Cambridge who insisted he was working on a thesis about forgotten neighborhoods of Boston. The student's voice carried over the music, weaving facts about the South End's history into anecdotes that made even James forget how out of place he had felt when he first arrived. On the staircase, two girls sat shoulder to shoulder, their laughter spilling into the crowd as they painted small doodles on each other's arms with black eyeliner. A man with a guitar had appeared almost out of nowhere, strumming chords that slowly began to replace the thumping playlist. People turned their heads, clapped to the rhythm, and soon the living room transformed into a stage without boundaries. By midnight, the atmosphere was electric. The city outside was quiet, but inside the house it felt as though time had slowed, allowing every detail to expand. The scent of spilt beer mixed with faint traces of perfume, while the old wooden floor creaked under the weight of dancing feet. Someone found a pack of cards, and a circle formed near the kitchen, shuffling, laughing, shouting playful accusations of cheating. It was around this time that Oliver, who had been quietly observing from a corner, noticed the way the gathering seemed to have no center. Unlike any other party, there was no host to guide the night, no schedule, no plan. It was a living organism, feeding on chance encounters and unscripted decisions. He scribbled a few words into a small notebook he carried. A house full of strangers, yet nobody feels lost. Meanwhile, Sarah had wandered upstairs, drawn by curiosity more than anything else. She pushed open a door to find a quiet study, the desk cluttered with papers that smelled faintly of dust. For a moment, the muffled laughter from below felt far away, replaced by the hum of an old radiator. She lingered, imagining the lives of whoever lived here, wondering if they knew their home had become the heart of an unplanned memory. Back downstairs, a sudden power flicker startled the room. The lights dimmed, and for a brief second darkness stretched across every corner. A collective gasp followed, then cheers when the lamps returned to life. Someone joked about ghosts. Another shouted that the house must have been waiting for this moment all year. The music rose again, louder than before, as if to chase away the thought of silence. At 1 in the morning, the energy had not faded. If anything, it had grown bolder. People who had arrived separately now spoke as though they had known each other for years. Phone numbers were exchanged, stories of childhoods in faraway towns surfaced, and debates about politics sparked in the hallway before dissolving into laughter. Near the kitchen sink, Emily finally struck up a conversation with James. They spoke about the oddity of the night, how neither of them knew exactly why they had stayed, and how it seemed impossible to leave when the air itself felt charged with possibility. He admitted he had considered slipping out earlier, but something invisible had kept him rooted. She confessed she had stopped caring about her missed calls. By 2 o'clock, a soft drizzle began outside, tapping against the old glass windows. Some guests leaned out to feel the rain on their palms, while others sang in unison to the guitar still strumming by the couch. The notes drifted through the air like smoke, lingering long after the chords had finished. The longer the night stretched, the more surreal it became. A small group sat cross-legged on the floor, sharing whispered secrets. Another pair disappeared briefly into the kitchen, only to return with sandwiches made from whatever they could find in the fridge, offering them like a midnight feast. The stairs had become a stage for storytellers. One person standing above the crowd while narrating tales that may or may not have been true. At 3:30, Sarah returned from the study, holding a book she had borrowed from the dusty shelves. She read aloud a random poem to the circle in the living room, her voice carrying over the murmurs. Silence followed for a moment, then applause, as though the house itself approved. There was no sign of the night ending, yet a quiet understanding grew among the guests that this gathering was fleeting. None of them had planned it, and none could predict when it would dissolve. That unspoken awareness made every shared glance, every burst of laughter, every echo of footsteps up the stairs feel heavier with meaning. By the time the first hints of dawn crept over the skyline of Boston, the townhouse had transformed. Empty bottles lined the fireplace, scraps of conversation still hung in the air, and the smell of rain seeped into the wooden floorboards. Some people had dozed off on couches, others leaned against each other in half-sleep, their voices reduced to whispers. Emily stepped outside, just as the morning light began to wash the street in pale gray. She turned back to look at the house, its windows glowing faintly from within, and felt the weight of something she could not name. Perhaps it was the realization that no matter where life would carry her, this one night, this unplanned collision of strangers, would remain suspended in her memory. Inside, James was still awake, scribbling names and numbers onto a napkin. He glanced around at the faces now softened by exhaustion and thought of how unlikely it all was. A house party that belonged to no one, yet left everyone with a piece of it to carry forward. As the sun finally rose, Boston stirred back to its usual rhythm. Cars passed, footsteps echoed on the pavement, and the world resumed its routine. But for those who had been inside that old townhouse, time had bent differently. They had lived a night that seemed to defy ordinary rules, a night stitched together by chance, held together by nothing more than presence. And though the party would fade into stories told over coffee, into messages exchanged and friendships tested by distance, the memory of the unplanned night in Boston would remain vivid, as though the house itself had whispered, "Sometimes the best moments are the ones nobody prepares for." The morning after the house party in Boston, the city streets were strangely quiet compared to the chaos that had unfolded the previous night. Empty beer cans and plastic cups rolled lazily along the sidewalks, pushed by a light breeze that carried with it the faint smell of smoke and damp earth. Neighbors emerged cautiously from their brownstone homes, exchanging glances that mixed disbelief with frustration. The police cars had left only an hour earlier, leaving behind a silence that felt almost unnatural after the constant hum of sirens, shouting, and music. Inside the once elegant but now battered townhouse on Marlborough Street, James sat slumped on the edge of a couch that no longer had any cushions. His head pounded, his shirt was ripped, and his phone was buzzing endlessly with missed calls and messages. Laura had disappeared sometime during the early hours of the morning, and he hadn't seen her since. Tom stumbled into the living room, his hair disheveled, a bruise forming on his jaw. He carried with him a half-empty bottle of water. He must have scavenged from somewhere in the wreckage. "You're still here?" James muttered without looking up. Tom gave a half-laugh, half-sigh. "Where else would I go? My jacket's gone. My wallet too. Pretty sure someone left with my shoes." James finally lifted his head, his eyes red from exhaustion. This wasn't supposed to happen. None of this was supposed to happen. Tom sat heavily on what remained of an armchair, the stuffing spilling out like entrails. "Yeah, but it did. And now the whole block knows about it. Half the city probably." The night before was already starting to blur into fragments of memory. But every time James closed his eyes, flashes of the chaos returned. Strangers climbing in through the windows, speakers dragged into the street, fireworks exploding in the backyard, police struggling to push through the surging crowd. And in the middle of it all, Laura disappearing upstairs with a group of people James didn't recognize. By noon, the house had begun to empty. Stragglers wandered off with dazed expressions, stepping over broken glass and torn streamers. A few tried to apologize to James on their way out, but most avoided his gaze entirely, as if embarrassed by the scale of what they had been part of. Outside, reporters were gathering. Word of the unplanned house party had spread quickly, and now cameras waited for someone to step forward with an explanation. James stayed hidden inside, peeking through the blinds with a growing sense of dread. Around 2 in the afternoon, Laura finally returned. She looked exhausted but strangely composed, as if she had been walking through the chaos untouched. She carried a small paper bag and set it down on the kitchen counter before glancing at James. "You need to get cleaned up," she said flatly. James stood slowly, anger and relief colliding inside him. "Where the hell were you?" Laura avoided his eyes, talking to people, making sure nothing worse happened. "Nothing worse? Look at this place, Laura. Look outside. The police, the neighbors, the press. We're ruined." She poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. "We're not ruined. Not yet. We just need to control the story before it controls us." Tom looked between them with a bitter laugh. "Good luck with that. The story's already out there. And it's not pretty." Laura finally met James's eyes. "Then we change it. We make it about something else. About something bigger than us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. James wanted to argue, to shout, to demand answers. But he could feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, muting his anger. By evening, the 3 of them had managed to clean a portion of the house. The broken furniture was piled near the back door, trash collected in dozens of black bags. The noise outside had faded, replaced by the occasional sound of reporters shouting questions into the night air. James sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. Dozens of messages from friends, colleagues, even distant relatives flooded his inbox. Some were mocking, some concerned, others simply curious. But one message from his employer made his stomach turn. "We need to talk first thing Monday." James dropped the phone onto the table and buried his face in his hands. Laura sat across from him, her expression unreadable. "You knew something like this could happen," she said softly. "No," James replied without lifting his head. "I never imagined anything like this." Laura leaned back, folding her arms. "Maybe you didn't want to imagine it, but it's here now, and you can't just wish it away. You need to decide what happens next." Tom, who had been pacing the kitchen, stopped suddenly. "Listen," he said. "Do you hear that?" They all fell silent. From outside came the faint sound of chanting. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk, their voices rising in unison. James felt his chest tighten. Laura stood and went to the window. "It's not just reporters anymore. There are activists, students, people holding signs." James forced himself to look. Sure enough, beyond the cameras were groups of people with banners, their faces determined. The words painted across the fabric weren't about the party itself. They were about housing, about inequality, about the city's growing frustration with wealth and privilege. Tom shook his head. "They've turned it into something else entirely." Laura smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Exactly, and that might just save us." The night deepened, and the air grew colder. Inside the townhouse, the three of them sat in uneasy silence, listening to the chants outside. For James, the weight of the party still pressed heavily on his shoulders. But a strange new current was forming in the chaos. The party had started as an accident, spiraled into disaster. But now, somehow, it had become part of something larger. And James couldn't decide if that terrified him more than the party itself. As the weeks turned into months, the memory of that unplanned house party in Boston became less about the chaos it had caused and more about the unlikely bonds it had created. People who had once been strangers now crossed paths in the city with warm nods and shared smiles, carrying the invisible thread of a single night that had brought them together. The living room that had once shaken with music and laughter now stood quiet. But if one looked closely, a faint trace of that evening still lingered in the air. An echo of voices, a ghost of unity. Life carried on. Some friendships faded, others endured, and a few blossomed into stories of their own. But everyone who had been there carried a secret certainty within them, that sometimes the most extraordinary chapters of life are written when no one is planning them. Boston, with its cobblestone streets and restless spirit, had witnessed many tales before. But for those who gathered on that September night, it was their own small legend, etched forever in memory. And perhaps years from now, when someone mentions a house party that nobody planned, there will be a pause, a smile, and a knowing glance exchanged among those who were there. Because they will remember not just the night itself, but the way it reminded them that serendipity is often the most powerful storyteller of all. Would you like me to craft an epilogue in the form of a reflective letter from one of the characters, maybe James or Emily, looking back years later at that night? That could give a very personal and emotional closure.